Hello and welcome back to the van build. It's been about a week and a half since that first planning video, and as you can see behind me, I got a pretty decent amount done. There's some insulation on the walls, there are holes in the ceiling, there's actually an extraction fan and a solar panel set up there, which you can just about make out the evidence of if you look close enough. And I'll talk about all of these things in future episodes, because today we're focusing on the thing I did right at the beginning. The thing I thought was the most important thing to do at the very beginning of the project, because I'd be standing on it and using it for everything else. That's right, today we're talking about the floor. So, flooring. And before we get on to the actual build segment in a second, I want to take a brief moment to talk about how flooring is constructed in vans, because it's the thing I wasn't really sure of. It turns out most van builds, you have three layers like this in this sandwich. You have a bottom layer of insulation, which prevents heat coming in or going out, also a little bit of sound insulation from road noise and such. You have a subfloor, which provides structural strength and a place to fasten things to. And you have a top finish layer of whatever you're finally walking on, because trust me, you don't want to walk on the subfloor, it's not very pleasant. So those three make up most van builds, and in this example here, I've gone with some pink 1-inch XPS foam for the insulation, I've gone with 1/2-inch plywood for the subfloor, and I've gone with luxury vinyl plank as the top option. Only one of these is actually in the van build behind me, and that's the luxury vinyl plank. Let me explain why quickly. So with all the layers, you have options. Insulation-wise, XPS is a pretty good choice. Unlike many installations, it actually has a pretty good PSI rating. It can take a human footprint even without subfloor, but with subfloor especially, it's pretty good at just taking that compression. But of course, the problem is the van's floor, it isn't flat. When it comes in the factory, the sheet metal has lots of crests in it to try and provide structural strength. And so if you do want to go and install something like this, you've got to spend a long time painstakingly cutting out bits of foam, laying it between all the ridges to make the sort of overall surface averagely flat, and then lay a second layer of foam over that to get a nice flat insulation surface. Now, I am generally pretty lazy with my builds, and there is another option for this, other than any sort of big sheets of foam. What that is a pre-made cargo mat. It's a closed cell foam. I think it's polyethylene, polystyrene, and some rubber in there. It's kind of a weird mix. But crucially, A, it's waterproof. Always a nice thing to have in an installation that's going to be under the floor. B, it is pre-shaped, not only the ridges in the floor, but also the curves in the side of the van. Literally, all you do, you get it out of the box, you unroll it. There's kind of a difficult time like handling it into the van. You lay it down and you're done. It saves so much time. It's not quite as good as this pink insulation in terms of insulation value, but it's pretty decent being a closed cell foam, and so that's what I went with for my insulation layer. Secondly is the subfloor. Now generally you'd want to use 1/2-inch or thicker, probably up to even 3/4-inch plywood for your subfloor. There's two reasons for that. One, structural. This is kind of giving your floor the flatness, and you want it to stay pretty flat. And two, it's a place to attach and screw things into, like cabinetry and such. And what I've done, I haven't gone for 1/2-inch, I haven't gone for the 3/4-inch, no, I've gone for 1/4-inch, and let me explain why. So you might think, well, Andrew, that's a ridiculous idea. How is 1/4-inch plywood going to even be useful as a subfloor? And there's two reasons for this. First of all, my top flooring is luxury vinyl plank. Now, some top flooring is like sheet vinyl, other things that are pretty flimsy or don't have any sort of rigidity of their own. However, luxury vinyl plank is pretty tough by itself, and so layered with the 1/4-inch plywood, you get about 1/2 inch of pretty decently strong material, and of course laminated like plywood is. So that gives you a pretty good structural strength by itself. Secondly, I'm not going to secure anything to my floor. I'm going to frame the entire inside using aluminium extrusion framing attached to the sides of the van. And so the flooring isn't ever going to have anything attached into it or be load bearing in sort of a sideways sense. So what that means is I don't care about how far screws can penetrate. Finally, of course, I'm tall. I'm trying to get as much inside height as possible. And even if it's saving 1/4 inch at a time, I will absolutely take it. So that is why I have taken 1/4-inch plywood. In this case, it's pre-finished underlayment for a little bit, again, of laziness and ease of use, but I've taken that as my subflooring material. So with that, you kind of get an idea of how floors are made. Obviously, the final thing is there are choices in top floor. I've got a luxury vinyl plank because it's waterproof. You can also use like wooden laminate like this. Pretty good option too. It is thicker, which is nice. It's thicker than the vinyl plank, good for structural again. Only problem with the laminate is it is not waterproof. If you have wet boots or spill something, it's going to suck up that moisture. And even here in dry Colorado, I don't want to risk that with my flooring. So I did not go down the laminate wood option. There's also sheet materials. You can use sheet vinyl. That's pretty good because you can get a single piece of flooring, which is really nice. It's not going to expand and contract with humidity or temperature like vinyl expands, contracts with temperature, wood with humidity. A sheet was not going to do that as much, or rather if it does, it's going to as a single option, as a single item. And so that really helps in terms of not having cracks appear and generally making the whole thing even more waterproof. Downside, of course, is it's a single sheet. You've got to kind of install it and stretch it, and also if there's a flaw or a problem in it, you've generally got to remove the whole sheet and replace it, and that's kind of annoying. I went for the plank stuff because with planks, if I do have to redo the flooring at some point, I can just unclick the planks, put a new plank in, re-click them together, and I'm done. So that's a reasonably good way of going about it. So with that, you've kind of got an idea of how the flooring is structured. And of course, the very first step is to put the installation in. So let's go and see how I did that. Once I got the cargo mat out of the box, the very first thing I did with it was lay it down on 4 sheets of plywood that I would use for my subfloor and trace around the outside of it. Because while the cargo mat is very handy that it's already shaped for the van, it's even handier as a template itself for what the van's floor is supposed to look like. And so tracing around it lets you save so much time at the later stage of cutting out the subfloor. Once that was done though, I did then wrangle it into the van and lay it down flat. There's no adhesive or anything here, it's just going to lay on the floor and the weight of things on top of it will keep it down there. Once the cargo mat was in, I then turned my attention to the subfloor. With the template pre-traced on it, I could just take my circular saw and first of all do the main straight cuts to bring it down roughly to the shape and size of the floor. Once the circular saw was done, I then moved on to the jigsaw, and the jigsaw was used to cut around all the pillars and other cutouts you find in the rather irregular shape of the walls in a van. This is one of the places where having a template really shines in terms of saving time. Once those sections were all cut out, I sanded the edges, making sure they were nice and smooth, test fit a few of the pieces to make sure they actually went in the van, and then laid down all 4 pieces inside. Once they were in, I then taped them together using a basic sort of large tape, just to give them a bit of structural stability and keep them as a single piece. And then once I'd done that, I used a little bit of adhesive to hold down the subfloor onto the foam layer. Not too much, just enough to stop it moving or squeaking around over time. I then wanted to fill in the edge I'd left around the outside. What I did is I took some masking tape and masked off the walls, and then I applied some spray foam. In this case, it was the brand Great Stuff, but any kind of filling spray foam will work in this situation, just to fill in that cavity between the van's walls and the floor, and of course provide some insulation of its own. Once I'd done that, I let it set overnight, and then took a nice sharp blade, and then just cut in at the floor level and peeled off the extra bits. This is where the masking tape comes in handy. It means it didn't stick to the walls. With the installation of the subfloor done, it's time to move on to the top layer. And this, of course, in my case, is luxury vinyl plank. Now, had I thought ahead, I could maybe have pulled off the same trick I did with the subfloor and used the cargo mat as a template to trace around the planks and get them to fit around the various nooks and crannies in the van. However, I hadn't thought of that, and at this point, my cargo mat was buried under, let's say, a subfloor and some foam. And so instead, I took some cardboard and used cardboard to trace templates of the various things, wheel wells, pillars, what have you. And these cardboard templates, it turns out, are just a very useful way of making sure you've got the right fit, because cardboard is easy to modify with a pair of scissors sitting right there. With the cardboard templates and some measurements, I traced onto my planks roughly where the cut lines should be. I used my table saw to trim them down to roughly the correct rectangular shape. And then once I'd done that, I used my jigsaw to cut around the fine lines of the various indentations and wheel wells and other protrusions into the floor shape. Of course, it's only the very far left and very far right rows that actually have odd shapes in the van. Everything else is pretty much square and flush and just needs a table saw to maybe shorten the length, but it's still useful to have the templates for those 2 rows. So I started on the left-hand row, installed that particular row first, and they're not too hard to install, these planks. When you install the row, you join the short end to the short end, and generally you just push them in and then tap them down with a dead blow hammer to lock them in place. It's really not that difficult. With the long edges though, as you would put a row to another row, that's a bit trickier. Obviously at this point, for the most of the van, you're just doing big normal sized planks, and so there's much less cutting, but getting them to sit perfectly flush I found pretty difficult. I needed to tap them slightly horizontally to get them to sit in place, but you can't just hit the edge of the plank because there's a very fragile lip on the edge that if you hammer it will get destroyed and the clicking functionality will get lost. And so instead, the trick that I found is to take a piece of sacrificial plank, maybe an offcut from something else you've cut already, that has the opposite matching edge on it, and then basically click that temporarily into place and use that as your hammering surface. That means all the force is transferred cleanly into the next plank over. It's not going to ruin anything because it's perfectly matching this surface. And this thing, well, it gets torn up, but you don't care about this. It's an offcut, so it makes that whole thing a lot easier. With that trick, I got pretty quickly through all the main center rows of the van up until all the way on the right-hand edge. And this is where things got a bit trickier, because not only have you then got to cut around the shapes and the wheel wells and the pillars again, but you also run out of room to hammer things in. Of course, up front by the cargo door, you do have the room and you can get it to lock in perfectly fine. But near the back right corner, you don't quite have that option. There's no space to swing a hammer, and so you kind of have to lever it in using a pry bar or other mechanism to try and get it to lock in perfectly. On the back right corner of my flooring, there's a very slight gap where it's not perfectly locked in, but honestly, I'm fine with that. It looks good at the front where I will see it and the living space. The section where it's slightly off, well, it's the garage. It's really not that big, and I imagine the expansion will be way worse. So I'm happy with it, and I can move on from there. Now, once the planks are installed, the main body of the work is done, but there's one final thing to make it look good, and that's make the edges finish nicely. Of course, the walls of the van, the edges are irregular, but it doesn't really matter because those are hidden under cabinetry or beds. We're not going to see them. But on the entrances, in this back entrance, on the side entrance, and in the front area where the cab transition happens, you can see the edge of the floor there, and you will be able to as the van is built out. And so in those places, I need to install some edging. Now, you can buy all sorts of different floor edging at various different places. I went to my local store and just got a few different varieties and tried them out. And in the end, I decided on two different shapes. There's this big old square one for the back. This is just a general one to make it nice and utilitarian. It's for a garage, it doesn't have to look particularly good. And on the front, I have a nice trim one that's like very much sleeker, slightly more color matched, and just goes over the vinyl. But for both of these, it's pretty easy to install. I installed an aluminium saw blade on my miter saw, cut it to length. Though I will admit I did measure wrong the first time. I had to go buy a second piece and cut it again. So as they say, measure twice, cut once. But with the second piece, I then filed down the edges of it to make it nice and smooth, had a nice test fit, and then put a little bit of adhesive in, drilled some pilot holes, and then nailed it down with some nice nails. With that done, I did a very similar process for the front, but in this case, the front edging is much thinner and just goes over the vinyl plank layer rather than over the whole flooring. And so this one is just secured with adhesive, but it pushes in and holds itself there very nicely. So that's what it took to install all three layers of my flooring and of course the edging for that nice trim look on the outside. Was it difficult? It wasn't too difficult. I did screw up a few times cutting the vinyl planks around those small pillars and wheel wells. It turns out it doesn't cut quite the same as wood using a jigsaw for obvious reasons, but thankfully I bought an extra box of planks over what I needed technically to give myself room to screw up. I like doing that when I can afford it, and it was really nice in this case because it meant I didn't have to go drive back to the store to buy more, so really lovely call on my part there. Apart from that though, it wasn't too bad. The use of the pre-cut cargo mat was, I think, really sensible. I've done a lot of installing insulation since then, as you can see behind me, and while it's not too hard to cut, the foam is super easy to just go through with any saw, it's very messy and very time consuming. And so, especially now, I really appreciate having saved that time up front by just having a pre-made cargo mat. And of course, it was a great template for the subfloor too, so it saved time in two different ways. So I think that was the right call. Is it going to be a little less insulating than other floors are? Yes, probably, of course, but The floor is the least important part of a build in terms of insulation. If you're in a cold environment, which this is Colorado, it's generally colder than the inside most parts of the year in the mountains. And so that's probably fine for me. I'm going to do a much more intense job of insulating the walls and ceiling of the van to keep the heat in that sense. So what's next? Well, it's actually the thing I've just finished doing as I record this, which is the roof. I spent the last 4 or 5 days up and down a ladder more times than I wish to count, and my legs are at least partially on fire. But as a result, there's now a roof rack up there, there's solar panel framing, there's solar panels themselves, there's cables for the panels, there's even a waterproofed entry gland for those cables, and all of that is next to a giant hole in the roof with an extraction fan in it. And I'm sure you can imagine the most terrifying part of this project so far was me cutting a giant hole in the roof of my brand new van. I have all that footage and more coming up for you in the next episode, so until then, I'll see you around.